good morning. I think I've introduced myself to almost everybody, but just in case, my name is Eric Quintane. This presentation is based on a project and a paper with Gianluca Canaducci from ESMT in Berlin. And we've been working on this for many, many years. And it's finally come through. So the talk is, as you may guess, it's about brokers, and more specifically about the process of brokerage. So I kind of assume, okay, I was hoping this would work. It doesn't work anymore. Okay. I kind of assume that if you're here, you know what a broker is. But just in case, a broker, a typical broker for us who study social networks would be Robert. And Robert is a broker because he has a specific position in the social structure. And we say that Robert is a broker because Robert spans structural holes. Here in that specific graph, the structural hole is between individuals 6 and 7 who happen to be in different groups. So Robert is the only direct link between those two individuals. What we know, and the reason why this is actually important and it matters, is that brokers actually tend to extract an advantage from that position. They extract value from a specific position in the social structure. And that value has been shown in multiple empirical studies to drive benefits for the people who occupy that position. They get better salaries, they get better promotions or faster promotions, and they are rated higher in terms of creativity. So this is actually an important position in the social structure. What we don't actually know very well is what happens. What do those brokers do when they engage in those information brokering activities that will generate value, obviously, but we don't really know what is the process of brokerage. We have ideas, but we don't know for sure. What we want to do, therefore, is understand a little bit more how brokers broker. What is the process of brokerage? And in order to build our technical framework, we actually focus on two specific insights from the recent literature. The first specific insight is that we have been made recently aware of the need to distinguish between position in the social. So we can actually distinguish those two things, being a broker and the process of brokerage. Now, the distinction is such that we know that it's possible to be a broker, to act as a broker, to have a process of brokerage, even though you don't have structural holes, even though you're not specifically in a position of a broker. And more importantly, and interestingly for us, there is actually, even if you have a structural hole between your contacts, it doesn't necessarily mean that you will engage in processes of intermediation. That means you will use information from one of your contacts in order to obtain benefit from another of your contacts. So that process of intermediation that we think arises because of a position in the social structure, it's not deterministic. And we've identified at least two different processes. So the literature has identified these two different processes that can exist given the existence of a structural hole. So we think about the broker. The broker is defined by the access to structural holes, so connecting people that are disconnected. And we know that we can have two different brokerage processes that can exist given those conditions. One is a Tertius gaudens process, which is I'll talk to one of my contacts, I'll talk to another contact, and I'll try to make sure that they don't talk to each other, because that's how I will generate value for myself. Another completely different strategic behavioral orientation is Tertius iungens, which is I'm talking to my contact, I'm talking to the other contact, and I bring them together, because I know that this is how I will generate most value. Another, yes, ma'am?
Just a clarification point on the last slide. Why does a social relation imply structure and information imply process? it seems, and I'm certainly aware of the two concepts, but it seems that in some ways it's a faulty dichotomy because structure is just, something that we as network analysts need to study them, to turn them into a matrix. But what is a tie? A tie is whatever happens to be the content or the process of a relationship. So is it really a real dichotomy? What is structure without process, for instance?
Okay, I think, I like the question very much, and I think this is part of my research agenda for the next 5, maybe 10 years. So trying to really understand the distinction between what is a relation and what would be interactions. I think they're not completely connected. So you can have a social relation, which is a cognitive construct, with someone even though you don't have many interactions. You can have interactions with someone even though you don't actually have, you don't conceptualize this as a social relation. So your point is well taken. I'm using this more in the spirit of Podolny, thinking about relationship as tubes through which you have information or resources that flow. So I'm simplifying this very complex problem just to say, well, you typically have those relationships, and relationships can be used as tubes, and we typically assume that within a relationship you will have information that flows. And when you think about brokerage from a Bertian sense, that's what you will have in mind. You will have in mind social relations and information that flows through it, and whatever you do is an intermediation process on the information that flows between actors that are connected with social relations. So that's the simplification that we're making right now. And the idea is that with those social relations, you have those tubes and information that flows. You can still have those two different types of processes. One is you keep those people separated, and another one is you facilitate information flows between the actors. Now the second point, which again goes in the direction of what Negwara was asking, is that we've been made aware of the fact that interactions are actually pretty important. And even though most of our network models and concepts are based on social relations, well, we might want to take a look at those social interactions. One specific reason is that, well, you can actually gain valuable information from talking to people who you don't have a social relation with. So, and that seems pretty obvious. I assume most of you have interactions, or probably on a day-to-day basis or week-to-week basis, with people that you don't have a social relation. You wouldn't say, yes, that's a friend or that's a colleague, just someone that you happen to talk for with that for a little while, and that can still lead to valuable insights. We're arguing that this is actually probably even more the case in what we call contemporary organizations. That means fairly dynamic workplaces where you have project teams, where you have distributed workforce, geographically speaking, where you have people who have to meet with each other for a short period of time to complete a project, to complete a task, and don't know each other very well. These people are not part of our imagery of social network analysis. We don't actually typically account for those interactions when we use our network tools and models. Now another point is, well, if you don't have interactions, so bridges or structural poles need to come from somewhere. And social interactions might even be the first step in building bridges and structural poles. So the way in which we conceptualize social interaction and social relations is we're trying to say that we differentiate between interactions that occur within existing long-term social relationships from those that occur outside of them. And based on that, we identify two different possible types of brokerage. One type of brokerage would be brokerage, that means use of information with individuals that are within your existing social network, And we distinguish that from brokerage or use of information with individuals who are not part of your social network. And we call them embedded brokerage for the first part, which is you actually use your existing network to broker information, which is where most of the study of brokerage have been placed, and unembedded brokerage, which is to broker information between contacts who are not part of your existing network. Just to give you an idea, this is part of the data we collected that we're using email data, and we have a full company. The red square in the middle is someone we identified as occupying the position of a broker, and the dark lines will be social relations, and the lighter lines are interactions. And just to give you an intuitive understanding, look at how much the interactions deviate from the social relations. So this will be about 2 to 3 weeks of data. 3 weeks of data. These are emails that are being sent. And here we're representing social relations, and you see that the space covered by interactions in a 2 to 3 weeks period goes way above and beyond those social relations. However, if you aggregate everything and you try to understand what are the social relations of that person, this is what we're going to get. So the extent to which individuals and brokers, in that case, interact with people within the organization is quite different from the network of social relations.
What is social relations there? Or you're going to come and tell us?
Yeah, I'll tell you. That's going to be a surprise.
That's a surprise? All right.
And that's one of the things I need to improve on for in future papers. But I'll spend time explaining that.
Okay.
The first hypothesis is simply that we differentiate between people in brokerage position versus people who are more densely embedded in a network of social relationship. And we're saying brokers will have a tendency to engage more in those unembedded brokerage interactions than non-brokers. That means if you're a broker, you'll actually tend to deviate quite a bit from your network of social relations. You will interact with a lot of people who are not in your network of social relations. The argument is very simple. We're saying, well, most people, they don't want to interact with strangers. They don't want to interact with unfamiliar people. They just want to interact most of the time with people that they know. Because it's easier, because it's safer, because people feel better when they interact with people that they know. However, what we know about brokers is that, well, they actually have an ability and a motivation to detect and pursue information brokerage opportunities. So they are more likely to deviate from that structural constraint, from that pattern of communicating with people that they know. We also know that they have a self-monitoring trait. And the self-monitoring trait is associated with a higher likelihood to connect with people that they don't know very well. So it's facilitating connection with strangers, which is not an easy thing to do. And what we also know from Berg 2010 is that brokers actually might tend to acquire specific skills because of their social position. So when they are brokers, they actually become better at connecting with people with different ideas from their own, at playing that role of intermediary. So those three things together will tell us, well, if someone could deviate from the tendency to interact with the same people, it would be brokers. Yes, ma'am.
So at first when you were starting to talk about this dichotomy of people, interacting with people you would consider relations versus those who are not, it almost seemed like you were describing a random process by which you'd encounter someone on the street and have some interaction that would lead some information. But this sounds much more strategic. So you need a particular kind of information so you at least know where to look, you know who to contact. You might not have an existing relation with them, but you're aware of that contact and the potential information they might have. So you seek them out.
Yeah.
Is that what you're describing?
So that's a very fine line. I'm trying to be careful in where I stand. I don't have the data to talk specifically about intention. So even though, in my opinion, it's clear that there is an intention, I can't actually prove that. So I can't answer that. I don't know if it's the broker who's actually actively seeking, if it's just a random process of exploration, or if it's people who are seeking the broker. And I can't distinguish.
But the interaction is an email?
Yeah.
So it can't, I mean, it has to be somewhat intentional, because he's not like just typing a random email address, right? I mean, he's got to get the information somewhere.
Sure, but unless I can say very specifically, I know what the intention was, I'm not measuring that. That's all I'm saying.
Sure.
So I'm just trying to be careful. But I think you're right in your interpretation, which is that I think that there is an intentional process. Now, exactly how that intentional process works, I don't know.
Sure.
And I hope I can actually solve that in the next paper. So that was the first hypothesis. The first hypothesis is if you're a broker, you're more likely to engage in those interactions, short-term set of exchanges that are not within social relations and that may never lead to a social relation. Okay. The second is where we connect the 2 points, the part about the type of brokerage process and embedded versus unembedded exchanges. What we're saying is that brokers, they not only tend to deviate much more from their social structure, so they engage with people with interactions, but they will also tend to engage in Tertius gaudens when they do so. That means those people will be separated. They don't know each other. They're not connected. Okay? And the reason why we say that, part of it is purely based on structural position. So, because these are people who are not connected to the network of the broker in the first place, it's much more space that these persons are not connected with each other either.
We have somebody joining us on Blue Team. That person hasn't muted their mic.
Can we just tell them?
Would you please? Yes.
If you're listening in, please mute your mic.
Yes. Please mute your mic. I'm so sorry.
What do you need to do?
Well, I don't think I can mute it from there.
No, I think that's okay. With
You should turn off the speakers here, because if you turn off the speakers, I don't think you'll hear the feedback.
Oh,
Can we do that just
yes,
here?
let's do that. Thanks.
Okay, let's try. No, not 3 yet. 1 and 2. So the second one is those brokers who engage in interactions will tend to engage in Tertius gaudens. That means they will not put those actors, those individuals that they're connecting with, they'll not contact them, they'll not put them together. And the reason, as I was explaining, is largely structural. It's because they're contacting people who are outside of their network, and therefore the likelihood that with short-term interactions those people will get together is just very low. And we're comparing that to the propensity of non-brokers who engage in that type of social interactions with unembedded interactions to connect people together. We also know that it's difficult for socially distant actors to bridge those gaps, to communicate directly together, and we use the cognitive skill argument to say, well, it's also more likely for brokers to detect actual disconnections in the social structure. So brokers will be able to identify holes in the social structure and interact with people across the holes more efficiently. So hypothesis is, well, because of those different structural and cognitive elements, it's more likely that the broker will actually interact with people who are not connected together and not put them in contact in the short term of social interactions. The third hypothesis is probably the more contentious given the current state of knowledge around brokerage and social network, and it's the opposite. We're saying, well, actually, when brokers engage in interactions or information brokering activities within their social structure, so inside their long-term ties, they will not tend to keep people apart, they will bring them together. And we base that on the main point is that brokers have been demonstrated have been demonstrated to be more socially attuned. They actually recognize what is a socially appropriate behavior. And we've seen that in several studies that brokers are able to change strategies depending on the situation. What we could also say is, or what we found in the existing literature, is that the value of structural holes decreases with time. So the longer the structural hole exists, the less beneficial it is for the broker. But what we also know is that, and you can relate to that in your own social relations, is that if you know two people very well and you actually try to keep them apart, you try to hide the presence or the existence of one to the other, that's probably not very nice. That's probably not something that will be very well accepted. So what we're saying is that, well, the brokerage in that sense, intermediation with people that you know well, might be inappropriate. Clearly, there are cases when it's not, and it's possible, but what we're trying to think is that in an organization where you need to work with specific colleagues, intermediating, so trying to keep those colleagues apart from each other for a long period of time, might not be very well seen. So overall, the idea is that when they engage in brokerage within their social circle, brokers will tend to bring people apart more than non-brokers. Yes, ma'am.
So I'm just wondering what your intuition is between these two, because I see two potential explanations for this, which seems really interesting to me. One would be like kind of what you're describing, which is being more or less strategic about connecting people, depending on if like you're in a situation embedded versus unembedded, in which it would be appropriate or efficient to kind of connect people, and that would be important for you and potentially helpful for you. Or is it about, because then that's also what you kind of suggested early on in the talk about people strategically keeping people apart.
Yes.
Or is it more about just trust? So in this situation, you have, you feel comfortable because you trust both of these people, they're strong ties, so you're comfortable connecting them. And the other, it doesn't even cross your mind. It's not a strategic keeping them apart, but it's just these are relatively one-off or not strong.
And you could just be exploring. You're just connecting, and you don't know if there is any potential for them to be connected. I agree. I think that's a good point. I hadn't thought about the trust element, that you trust people enough to put them in contact together. I think that's a pretty good argument. But the idea is exactly this one. The idea is that with your social relations, you're going to actually behave in a different way. And it might be a strategic, intentional behavior to get value. It might be a question of trust. But the way in which you will broker information in your social circle is going to be different from the way in which you broker information outside of it. And outside of it, there are multiple reasons that make us think that you're more likely to keep those people apart. And inside, you're probably going to tend to bring them together and try to coordinate action with them. Yes, please.
I can kind of see the different strategies when you compare short-term versus long-term. But this hypothesis is comparing those who are in unembedded brokerage positions versus those who are in denser network positions. So my question is, why would somebody in a brokerage position be more likely to adopt a Tertius iungens strategy compared specifically to somebody who's in a denser network position?
So that's actually, yes, I think you raise a very good point. So the point is, it makes sense when we compare between embedded versus unembedded, but why is it a broker versus a non-broker? So someone who is more densely embedded will not actually do that. And I think that's why we have the first point, which is our argument is based on the idea that brokers will be more sensitive to situationally appropriate type of behavior. That means, on average, they'll tend to intermediate a little bit less from their social contacts. Now, I completely agree with your comment, which is that's probably not a very strong tendency. And as you will see in the results, that's what we find. It's not a very strong tendency. At the same time, if we go with Michael's suggestion or Michael's idea of strategic, intentional behavior, then what we're saying is that those brokers will actually tend to bring people together in a way to coordinate activities. And that might be something that differentiates them from someone who is not in that brokerage position.
So it's the difference between, it comes down to intentional or strategic versus non-strategic actions?
So it comes down to, so for me there are multiple explanations. One of them will be situationally appropriate behavior, which is that when you are in a group of people that you have long-term social relationship with, you're not going to try to keep them apart, which is what, if we strictly follow Bird, that's what you would be expecting. You would be expecting those long-term contacts to be the conduit for intermediation. Okay. What we find is that, or what we argue is that yes, there is a process by which brokers realize that this is not going to be appropriate, and that might gain even more value in bringing those people together. So I'm trying to avoid going too much into strategic intentionality again because I don't have the data to prove it. But I think the logic of the argumentation it has to, it's very hard to deviate much from it. So there is an intention for the broker, and we assume that this is going to be to generate value, and that value generation process in long-term social relation is much more likely to come from a Tertius-iungens strategy than from a Tertius-gaudens. And what we assume is that people who are not in a brokerage position are going to be less sensitive to that need and less aware of the need to bring people together to coordinate them. Okay, so it's just a short summary. That's what we've said so far. We've made a distinction between two different types of processes: Tertius-iungens, which is to bring people together; Tertius-gaudens, keep them apart. And we've distinguished between embedded and unembedded interactions, brokerage interactions, which is within social. So unembedded is outside of social relationship, and embedded is within social relationship. And what we're saying is that brokers engage more in those unembedded interactions than non-brokers. And when they engage in unembedded brokerage interactions, they'll tend to do a Tertius-gaudens strategy. When they engage in embedded brokerage interactions, they'll actually try to bring people together and have a Tertius-iungens strategy. Now, the empirical setting is one medium-sized digital agency. This is a project-based organization. It has offices in Europe, in the US, and in Japan. And it's typically working for large clients who ask them to build intranet, extranet, and to help with online advertising. What we obtain is 8 months of email communication between all of the employees in the organization, and that was about 600,000 emails. Now what we did was we removed all emails sent or received by external people, so we kept only internal emails. And for the results that I present you, we focused on just emails sent to one recipient. Now, this has been pretty common in studies that use email to focus on one recipient email, because, and especially for our study, it's more likely to be emails that are used for brokerage purposes. Think about sensitive information, not public information. However, what we did was simply to do robustness checks with 2, 3, and 4 recipients, and the results I present are the same with those robustness checks. So the final data set is about 75,000 email messages, and what we have, the reason why we use email is that it gives us very, very fine-grained information about the time at which emails were sent. Therefore, we can distinguish between emails that have been repeated for a long time versus emails that have been just one-off, or just for 1 week of interactions that have not repeated more than that. And that's where I'm already starting to explain to Ned how we operationalize social relations versus social interactions. Now, we have a lot of information about demographic characteristics, like hierarchical level, gender, location, language, tenure, function, reporting, and contractual status. So we control for all of that in our models. Now, I also did a lot of visits and interviews with people inside the organization. I worked with them for a while, so I've been able to talk to them about the results that we found and about our theory and try to see if that had face value for them. Now, the first step in the analysis was simply to identify who is a broker and who is not a broker. And we did that in a very traditional fashion, and Adam Kleinbaum did something very similar, which is you just collapse all of the email exchanges, you calculate constraints, and then we calculated some kind of a broker score, which is 1 minus constraint. So we transform constraint a little bit, we removed the zeros and converted them into 1, and we transform constraint using a log, which is very specifically, which is what Bird does in most of his papers. So what I'm showing that prominently just to say, this is what you would typically, this is the typical way in which you would identify someone who is in a brokerage position. Now, the core of our modeling strategy is based on the relational event model. And the relational event model, which you may be familiar with, is derived from the relational event framework that has been created by Scatterberg in 2008. And the essence of that framework is that we assume, well, we predict the existence of one email, sorry, start that again. We align all of the emails as a sequence over time. So from the first email to the last email, we just put them all in a sequence. And what we do, we use that sequence, in that sequence we use each email one after the other, and we predict that email based on the email communication patterns that existed prior to that email. What this enables us to do is we don't aggregate. We don't aggregate the sequence of email into one or several cross-sections, which is what we've just done to identify the brokers. Now, so we have the sequence of emails for the last 8 months, and just for definitional purposes, one email actually is an event that connects two different individuals, so that's why we call it a relational event. And the assumption that we make is that those events arise independently. So I'm emailing you independently, and it's conditional on the realized histories, that means the emails that we actually know about of past events, and also the characteristics of the sender, of the recipients, and other characteristics of the environment. I'll go a little bit more in depth, but we estimate the model using a multinomial conditional logistic regression, which is similar to the Cox procedure, which is the Cox procedure in SPSS. So it can be estimated using that procedure. So that's a more graphical representation of what we did. We have time, we align all the emails across time from 2, because we can't model 1 because there is no prior history, to n, which is the last email. And then for each email, we go back in time and we calculate a series of statistics either over the entire period or for 1 week in order to predict the likelihood for those specific statistics to lead to the existence of that email. Now, this model works with what we call a reset, which in the Cox regression is we're using a stratum. And what we do is that for each event, we select randomly potential events that could have occurred at the same time as the real event, and we compare that real event to all the potential events that we've selected. So for each of those events, we actually build a set of potential events that we use, and we calculate all the different statistics for each of those potential events. And we do that for all the events. That means from the 75,000 emails, we actually end up with more than 1 million data points because we are adding all the different potential events that could have existed at the same time. And that would, yes, please.
Are those all the potential events or just a random selection?
So
all would be prohibitive at this?
So we've played around with that, and yes, you're right. All of the events, that's 129 times 128 for each of the 75,000 events, that's a lot. I did that. I used, I let my computer run for a long time. But it doesn't lead to any improvement or change in the results or improvement. And from what I've read in the literature, there's even the possibility that by doing that, we actually end up estimating just rare events. So my view of my understanding of the extant literature is that it's actually better to take a random sample. I've been experiencing with purposeful samples. So I've tried to select people that I thought we should compare with, and I haven't had a lot of luck with that. It led to very strange sets of results. With the random sampling, I've used a different number of random samples, 20 events, 100 events, 200 events, even 2,000 events, and I couldn't find any difference in the results that we're presenting. So I think from a relational event modeling, that selection of the potential event is still an unknown. We don't know what is the best practice or what exactly is the impact of that specific selection process. My experience with this project and another project that I've published in organizational research methods is that it actually doesn't make such a big difference. So I tend not to worry too much about it. I will always do a check with the full sample of potential events just to make sure if it's possible. So the way we distinguish, so as you may have noted, we don't actually have social relations in our data. What we have are emails. And the way in which we distinguish between what we call social relation and social interactions is using time. And what we're saying is that interactions that represent social relations are interactions that will have been occurring with the same people with regularity for a long period of time. While unembedded interactions that are outside of those social relations are the same emails, but that have not been repeating for a long period of time, and that will not be repeating for a long period of time. Yes?
To go back to Ned's original point about potentially the false dichotomy between a social relation and an interaction, because a social relation can't exist without an interaction. I mean, you could get around that by just not, saying that this is really about embedded versus versus unembedded interactions, or embedded versus unembedded relations, right? Because that's the difference. It's not whether it's a social relation versus an interaction outside of your social relation. I think a lot of people would say, if you interact with someone, you have a social relationship. Now that relationship might be fleeting, and it might be weak, and it might be unembedded. But I think some people would I understand what you're saying, but I think you could just say, these are embedded versus unembedded relationships, or embedded versus unembedded interactions.
No, I'm sorry. I tend to disagree with that.
Okay.
For me, a social relation is different from an interaction. Social relation is cognitive, it's conceptual, it's a perception. So you are attributing, you're giving a specific value to an interaction, or to a set of interactions. And they're not completely related. You can have a social relation with having very few interactions. So for me, there are no unembedded social relations, not in my sense at least. Social relations, it's the conduit, it's what embeds the interactions. And for me, the only thing that we can observe that physically exists are the interactions. The general idea is that having interactions within a social relation or outside of it actually makes a difference. Now, whereas
which I buy. But for you, social relations are strong ties.
They can be weak tie, but it's something that you cognitively represent as something more than just a bunch of random interactions. It's something that you will say that person is a friend or that person is an acquaintance. So you put it in a cognitive category.
You being the ego.
The ego, yes. And you have a conceptual representation of this. Now, obviously, there is a fine line between a very weak social relation and interactions. And I don't know exactly where that line is. I haven't been able to conceptualize it, and I don't know if it's possible to conceptualize the difference. But at least to take the extreme between those strong social relations and just interactions, I think you can intuitively understand yes, there is a difference between those two. Okay, so repetition of communication with the same as the period of time. So what for us is going to be important is the fact, not necessarily, and I'm trying to be careful with not moving too much towards tie strengths, what we're trying to say here is that it's actually the repetition over time, the regularity of the exchange that is representative of the social relation. Even though I know it defies what I just said in terms of a cognitive category, because we're clearly not measuring a cognitive category here. But that's the best we could do with the data, which is to say, well, this intentional exchange of information over a long period of time is the best we can do to represent the social relation. And here we have exchanges that are not repeated over a long period of time. And because we include both of them in the model, this is going to be marginal to the embedded interactions, or interactions that have been repeated over a long period of time. So we're going to look at patterns that deviate from the long-term interaction patterns. The statistics are actually pretty simple. We're always predicting the next email in the sequence. So we predict 75,000 emails, more or less. And what we do, we have a set of independent statistics that we calculate both for embedded and unembedded interactions. And what we have here is an interaction between a short-term unembedded interaction statistics and a brokerage score. So what we're saying, and this is, sorry, that's going to be useful to test our hypothesis one, which is we're expecting that if there is a broker, that broker will tend to send emails in the short term that deviate from a long-term pattern of interactions. The other two statistics are to test hypothesis 2 and 3. Well, actually, 2 and 3 are tested by this statistic in the short term and in the long term. And short term being unembedded, long term being embedded. And what we're saying is that if the broker is here, or the more that the person intermediating two individuals is a broker, then the patterns that we will see in associating the statistic with the dependent variable will be different. So what we're expecting is that we're always predicting the email here. We're always predicting that event. What we're assuming is that if there is a broker and we're looking at embedded interactions, then the existence of a broker in that path between the two items will be significantly associated with the existence of the email. That means we will have a Tertius process, because we will see both of them occurring together. If it's in an embedded interactions, then the existence of the broker, the position of the broker here, will lead to the absence of this email. So we'll expect a negative sign here, because that means if I am a broker and I am having unembedded exchanges with those two people, they'll not be communicating. The models are slightly more complex than that in the paper, but that's because we included a whole range of controls. But the basic idea is here. So we have the unembedded brokerage interaction, which is our hypothesis one, which says if you are a broker, the more of a broker you are, the more likely you are to interact with people who are not part of your network of social relations. And this is what we find is a positive, significant results. Now, this is using the relational event model. We also did checks just with count models, and we find exactly the same results. So we've tried always to go back to simpler models and descriptives to make sure that we're not over-interpreting a sophisticated statistical analysis. Hypothesis 2, which is Tertius by brokers in unembedded exchanges or in unembedded interactions, we find a negative sign, which is what we're expecting. What this means is that if the broker is intermediating those two alters, then they tend not to communicate with each other. This pattern is associated over the 75,000 emails to the lack of existence of an email. And hypothesis 3 is Tertius by broker in an embedded set of exchanges, and what we find is that brokers, more than what we expect from, or more than non-brokers, will tend to close that structural hole. Now, this is where we see this is not a huge effect, and I agree with you. It is still it is still not a very strong tendency, especially if you compare it to a normal tendency for closing those relationships when you talk about anyone who is not a broker. So this will be our baseline tendency, and the effect is much stronger here. But the baseline tendencies are pretty strong in our data set. Okay, we did a whole bunch of robustness checks because I realized relational model is still pretty new. So what we've done, we've tried to replicate or to test as many assumptions as possible. And the first thing is that we actually replicated the whole set of analysis in a different company, because the editor was telling us, well, it's working in that specific company because it's a project-based organization and you're not controlling for project interdependencies. So we found a different organization. We collected all of their email data. It's not a project-based organization. We ran the same set of analysis and we found exactly the same results. Now, we also could be, our results could be sensitive to the way in which we calculated constraints. So we tried to identify the top 10, top 20 brokers. We selected emails with 1, 2, 3, and 4 recipients. We dichotomized the matrix of emails to calculate constraints above 0, above 14. We used a volume, reciprocation, normalization method. So we've done a whole range of checks to make sure that we found the same results. We also operationalized short-term, so unembedded exchanges as one day or 1 week, and long-term as 3 months of full bed of observations. And we've run a whole lot of additional controls. It's impossible to be completely certain of our results, but we've done everything we could to make sure that our basic assumptions are not changing the set of results that are presented. So the conclusions are, at least from what we've been able to find in our data set, or in our 2 data sets, that brokers engage in unembedded brokerage. Brokers deviate from structural reproduction tendencies and they try to interact with people who are not part of their social network. When they engage in unembedded brokerage, they tend to adopt a Tertius gaudens strategy. That means they will contact people who are not connected together, and the likelihood of a direct connection between them is pretty low. Now, and when they engage in embedded brokerage, that means brokerage when they exchange information with within their social relations, they adopt the Tertius iungens strategy. That means they bring people together. Now, we think that this project actually has quite a few implications. The first implication is simply that we're actually managing to explore, we found a way to explore how structure and process are interrelated. And most studies so far have been trying to look at either one or the other. Either they set the position as fixed and they look at the process, or they forget about the process and just look at the position. This is important because it enables us to understand a lot more what structural autonomy could be. But here what we see is that having a constraining, in Bird's sense, constraining social network actually, I'm writing it in a different way. So having a less constraining social network, so if you're more of a broker, it enables you a lot more freedom in deviating from your network structure. So the structural autonomy is actually, as far as we can see, an autonomy in deviating from tendency towards social reproduction, which is important because it tells us how new ties are being created. In most of the network literature, we know about change as being mainly inertia, or at best, triadic closure. How do networks change? Bird is proposing a decay rate of bridges of, I think it's 90% over 1 year. We look at the churn paper by Sasovova, and we have a lot of churn in our networks, yet our theories are focusing on the imprinting of social structure. We know a lot more about social reproduction than about deviating from social structure. So what we're proposing here, I think this is the first glimpse, well, probably not the first, but it is a glimpse at a possibility to understand how networks evolve, how they change, how they deviate from the structure that they had in the past. As you can see from my results, though, there's a lot of structural reproduction, or the majority of the evolution is based on structural reproduction. But we still have people who are able to deviate from it. Sorry, I'm repeating myself, but this leads us to a slightly different role of brokers. It's more of a communal role of brokers, because we typically conceptualize those brokers as individuals who will benefit from these connections. But what we see here is quite different. They are agents of structural change. They are able to identify this connection, talk to those individuals, and then probably bring them together, which is a very different imagery than the one that we've had so far. The network churn is one of the things that could be explained by this set of results, and what we're trying to focus now on with Gianluca is trying to identify the locus of value creation. So our results basically open up two different set of explanations in terms of value creation of brokerage, which is what I started with. I was telling you, brokers do better. They extract value from their position. Now we have two options. One option is, well, whatever they do in the unembedded exchanges, that's actually just exploration. They identify those relationships that are really valuable, they bring them in for the long term, they develop them, and this is where they generate value from. Another option is actually the long term or the social structure is just a residue. It's just what you get when you are so active in exploring so much, and the exploration is where the brokers generate value. We don't know. We don't have the data to test it. Next project, that's what we're trying to do. And that's, I was thinking you might be interested in more generally relational event models. So these are the type of projects that I've been working on using relational event models. And some projects in just fun. Yes, please.
So, in your data analysis and also like the hypothesis, you assume the brokers are stable. So I mean, like throughout the your observation time, brokers, yeah,
they are stable.
Okay,
it's not an assumption.
So they are stable.
They are stable. I checked it. Yes, we looked at constrained evolution. We looked at top 10 brokers, top 20 brokers in different time periods, and those people are actually stable.
But I think the Bird's kind of recent paper kind of argues people have oscillated their positions.
He's saying that it's the oscillation that generates value.
Yeah.
So, and that's a funny argument, because what he's saying is that the final structure is still a brokerage position, and the oscillation is what differentiates between brokers that generate value and brokers that don't generate that much value. So I assume what you will be arguing is my brokers should be oscillating as well.
Yeah, but no.
I didn't find that. At the same time, I don't have performance here. So I might be focusing on brokers that have mixed performance at the end of the day. I don't think so, because I've been with my interviews and working with the organization. I know those people. I have seen how they work, and there is no. It's a Dutch company, so everything is pretty equalitarian, and their bonuses are based on tenure rather than performance. So I don't have hard measure of performance, but I've been able to interact with them, and I know that the top brokers that I've identified here, and I've tried this with only 10 people who are the top brokers, and it works as well. I don't know how to reconcile those different and conflicting insights.
Did you test whether brokers adopted both strategies for different parts of their network, or were there some brokers that would choose one over the other?
That's a good point.
No, types of brokers, or?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I haven't tested it. So I think that would be really interesting, because what my intuition is that a lot of the exploration might actually occur outside of functional boundaries. And a lot of the closing in might occur inside the functional boundary of the broker. And I want to test those ideas in the next project where I have a little bit more data than that to do it.
Just to riff on that very quickly, and only a comment. I was thinking of, as you were presenting, it reminds me a lot of, in the way you just put that with the functional groups, it reminds me a lot of Kraghart's EI ratio, or the EI index. So if that might be, as you push that to looking at, do these more endogenous emergent relations also map to other categories or groups, then it seems like Kraghart's approach would be a perfect fit.
Yeah, I think you're right. What I want to be able to do, following on that, is identify whether the broker adds value, that type of broker, an embedded brokerage activity, adds value to the broker or to the people around the broker. And by using concepts or measures such as the EI ratio, I think I can tap into this by looking at ties that cross those functional boundaries and that can bring value to the group more than to the broker, him or herself. Yeah.
Another thought that occurred to me was that you're testing the Tertius iungens somewhat implicitly by seeing if the two people who are being brokered actually talk to each other. I wonder if you could use the two recipient emails to see the broker connecting the two people directly.
Yeah, I have thought about this. My problem with this is I don't think email is that clean in terms of it's very noisy data source. And I have been trying to do slightly more specific modeling, but I'm not convinced that I know exactly what I'm picking up. So going into very specific differences between the one email data set, two email data set, three recipient email data set, and trying to interpret those differences in a meaningful way, I'm not there yet. I think I need, if I had the content, if I knew exactly what the email is saying, I knew that there is someone put in relation with someone else with those emails, I would try. But I think it's pushing a little bit the limits of the data set.
Can you see CCing or forwarding?
I can't.
Because then, I mean, that would be...
I know, but
like
my data set is just anything after that. If you work with email data, it really depends on the IT departments. And my email data set, I just have sender, recipient, and the time of the message. And that's it. And I know that some people have been able to gather a lot better data than that. There's been AGS, I think, paper published by Samir.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, with the cultural misfits. It's a beautiful paper, and he's using all the richness of the content of the email. I don't have it. So if Samir sends me his data set, I'm doing it. I think we are probably out of time, correct?
Wait,
Okay.
well,
thank you very much.
thank you.
Thank you.